Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Greg McPherson, City Club President. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel along with all of you watching or viewing on OPB, Portland Community Media, or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are The Standard, Bank of the Cascades, Stoll Reeves LLP, Family Care, and Russell Fellows Properties. In addition, today's program is also supported by Legacy Health, Oregon Health and Science University, Kaiser Permanente, Adventist Health, Artslandia, and Kink FM. Today we're discussing something that's often difficult to see and even more difficult to talk about, mental illness. Our guests will take a deep dive into its impacts on families and what, if anything, we can do to create a world where those suffering from mental illness are treated as compassionately and holistically as those suffering from cancer or a broken bone. Here with us is Storm Large, a Portland-based singer, actor, and author of Crazy Enough. While known as an entertaining force of nature, Storm's book and background tell a more tragic story. At the age of 9, a psychiatrist told her she would go crazy like her mother. Next is Dr. Chris Ferentinos, Director of Behavioral Health at Legacy Hospital and a leading advocate for the forthcoming Unity Center, a Portland-wide collaboration to consolidate mental illness care and to create a 24/7 psychiatric emergency service. Leading the conversation is Sheila Hamilton, a 5-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, radio host at Kink FM, and author of All the Things We Never Knew, a memoir about loving and losing her husband to mental illness. Having missed the signs, Sheila's husband died within 6 weeks of a formal diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Please welcome today's guests to City Club.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here today, and especially to share the stage with these incredibly intelligent and compassionate women. I'm most likely to call both of them friends. And I know that given that we're celebrating 100 years at the City Club, and Storm has a phenomenal voice, I think that we should all sing happy birthday to the City Club. What do you think? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear City Club. Happy birthday to you. Send in the strippers. You only get to do that every 100 years, so I hope to see you next centennial. Storm, I have never seen you more powerful than your one-woman show, Crazy. It was so profoundly honest and ambitious, and I'm wondering what the benefits and the drawbacks were of speaking so openly about mental illness in that kind of performance.
Thank you. The hardest part of expressing something so private and sad in my memory. I'm used to being very strong and rock and roll and Teflon and untouchable on stage, lit and electrified and louder and bigger. And to reveal the fear and anxiety and pain that I experienced growing up was counterintuitive to my performance muscle. But honestly, the hardest thing in writing the piece was realizing my own participation in alienating and discriminating against someone with mental illness who was my mother.
That's such a profound answer. And Dr. Ferentinos, I'm really curious whether you see that in your practice, whether you see family members actually being part of the stigma, part of the shame, and part of the humiliation that surrounds mental illness.
Sheila, that's so common. It's just very hard for a family member to admit that they actually have someone that needs care. And in so many ways, I think what one of the things that it's our job as celebrities, or in my profession, with Unity Center, it's going to be to make mental health okay, a cool thing, just another disease, a brain disease that we all can have. 1 in 5 people have it. And so to make it something that we can talk about.
1 in 5 of us in the audience have suffered from a serious mental illness, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share how many of you have loved someone with a mental illness, just to get a show of hands. It is almost a majority of people in the room. And when I was going through the difficulties with my husband, it was very isolating. I honestly felt like I might be the only person who'd witnessed a person go through psychosis. We were very confused. It was a very chaotic time. And what I ended up feeling was that a large portion of the responsibility falls to the caregiver to try to figure out what's next. And yet there's no standard of care. And so Storm, when you were witnessing this, you were a young child. What was your experience like?
We were told before we knew what was happening that Mom was tired, and there were a lot of hushed tones amongst the adults. And when we would have to go stay at a friend's house because there was blood in the bathroom and there were pills, vomit everywhere, the grown-ups would have a very pitying, knowing look on their face. And then ultimately, as years went on and we started to realize actually Mom wasn't tired, she was trying to hurt herself, trying to kill herself. And I believed that I was going to end up in the same mental state as my mother. I defensively created a barrier between us where fear and, empathy, I mean, it's your mother. You have an unstoppable channel of empathetic understanding of one another. You are of one another. And to build a really thick, strong barrier of resentment, of anger, eye-rolling, teenage stuff, but teenage stuff with a real vengeance, to protect myself.
Chris, how do you think it is that we begin to teach people that suffering a mental illness is like suffering a failure of any other organ, that the brain is just another organ, it gets sick and it gets better, so that we don't have this kind of divisiveness, this shame and this humiliation that tends to surround mental illness?
Well, if you stop to think about how mental illness affects us and addiction, let's not forget that, it affects our actual behavior, how we present to the world. So the very organ that is supposed to be the executive function, the prefrontal cortex, that is our executive function, that it's actually controlling our emotions and controlling how I behave here right now and what I say, etc., it's not working. So for that reason, there's a lot of blaming, because it's as if you're making it happen. It's as if you have control over that. It's as if you have a way of stopping it. It's volitional. And a lot of it is not volitional. And addictions is a good example. Some people starting to use drugs and to drink, it's definitely people do because it's volitional. People want to feel better or feel good. But at some point, there's a switch in the brain, and it's not volitional anymore. And people don't know that. So you have to educate folks in that.
Storm, how do you think your treatment of your mother might have been different if you'd actually understood what mental illness was? And do you think that a child could be capable of actually understanding it?
I think children, we tend to want to protect children naturally, but I think in the case of being in a home with someone as volatile and desperate as my mother, I think it would have been incredibly helpful for an adult authority figure to be compassionate with us and to explain that what was going on with my mother was an illness, and she wasn't trying to poison me because she hated me. It was a function of her illness. But it brings me to, now I know things have moved light years ahead since the 70s and 80s, but the 70s were draconian with mental health and the way doctors dealt with family members and the way doctors dealt with patients. It was literally shooting in the dark, trying to figure out the brain chemistry, what exactly was the drug to prescribe. And so we would get a different human every time she would come home from the hospital. She would be on Thorazine, she would be on something, another antipsychotic that made her rock and tremor and make her even more terrifying. And there was this atmosphere of, we know better, we know what's wrong with your mother, so you just let us take care of it, and you just be a good girl and go to school and shut up, basically.
Sheila, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So what made you want to come public with your struggles and with the whole story with David?
I think that witnessing David's shame and his humiliation over having an illness was the catapult for me to be public. I wanted, in the aftermath of his death, to do something so brave and so raw and so honest that it was almost like the antidote to his shame. I felt like once I began researching how many families are affected by mental illness and how many families had gone through the same sort of trauma that we had in the system, that I wasn't alone, and that other people needed to hear that there was someone with a voice and the ability to actually write it down and the ability to research what might be working that could put it out there to the world. And I'm just so grateful that it started a conversation like this one.
It definitely has. I'm very impressed with how much your book is actually making people talk about it. And it's really a gift to our community and a larger community.
Thank you. Storm hits on something about, thank you very much. Storm hits on the way in which psychiatry, inpatient treatment worked for her mom, and describes it in these draconian terms. I have to say, Chris, my experience in watching my husband's treatment was very much the same. It was as if one flew over the cuckoo's nest wasn't quite as bad as what we experienced. And I know that we're changing things with Unity Behavioral Healthcare, that we are changing things through so many of the health systems here that are now believing in an integrated system of care. But how do we move people along in a much quicker pace so that they understand this is the difference between life and death for families?
Well, I want to say that, so Unity Center for Behavioral Health is this incredible collaboration between Legacy, Adventist, OHSU, and Kaiser to come up with a more comprehensive acute care model for behavioral health emergencies, for whenever somebody's having a mental health crisis, that they can actually go to a ER that is actually dedicated to behavioral health emergencies with psychiatrists and nurses and people that know really what they're doing. But I want to go back to your question and say that I think medicine is changing over time in a much more team-based approach, a much more patient-centered approach. Also, all of the knowledge that we have today in how trauma affects the brain and how actually you have to really educate your providers in a trauma-informed care, in a way of addressing people that you're not going to re-traumatize. In fact, that you're going to work with them to be able to succeed and enter recovery. So those are some of the elements of the sort of new way of doing medicine, much more less hierarchical and much more collaborative, team-based, because all disciplines are important.
So someone with a family member or someone who is feeling something coming on, that they might have a question of their own mental stability, the natural order of things is they go to a doctor. And in my experience, and Sheila, probably yours, there is a tendency amongst doctors, forgive me for all the doctors in the audience, but there is a very cavalier attitude with some doctors, mental health doctors, that they know exactly what's going on, because I guess they have to, and they have to assure the patient. So in terms of, another opinion, I mean, these people, a lot of people are really desperate, and they want answers, and they want help. And if someone says, I know what to do, they will latch on to that. So what is your advice to family members who are not necessarily in an acute situation, but approaching one? How can they find the care that they need and not run into a doctor who is going to play God with their brain chemistry?
Yeah. Well, I really think there's a whole concept of patient activation that goes on now. And what that really means is it's patients taking the reins of their care. Not that the knowledge of medicine is not important, it's fundamental.
Right.
But there's so much information now that you can question, and you can be prepared to ask those questions when you go see a doctor. That inquiry, being part of your own recovery, it's one of the skills that we teach when we're teaching resilience for people that are struggling with a mental illness. It's like, okay, be part of it. Ask questions, get a second opinion.
Yeah.
Be curious.
And I would just add to that also, as an advocate for a person with mental illness, to really do your research and understand the profound effects of mindfulness, the profound effects of exercise. The ultimate elixir is sleep. So many of these things that we take for granted in our daily lives that are so good for our health are really the underpinning of good mental health. And so good mental health is good health. And what happens, I think, when people are in crisis is they're like, oh my God, just give us the pills.
Yeah.
Well, by the end of my husband's treatment, he was on 13 different medications, and he wasn't any better. He felt as if the only answer for him was a psychotropic approach, and he really ended up losing hope when those didn't work. We need to instill hope at every level and give people lots of different avenues to be able to find their way out of their crisis, because recovery is possible. And if there's one thing I want you to leave with today, to tell your friends if they're suffering, is that recovery is possible. And we have so many partners whose faces I recognize who now instill this in their patient care. Find those providers who believe in your ability to recover.
Well said, well said.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. I'm curious, Storm, about your trajectory. Could you tell us, like, how art fits into the big picture of you becoming who you are and actually, you know, finding your own way into the chaos that must have been growing up with your mother?
Well, art, for me, art and music especially, is kind of an articulated way to scream your guts out and to express feelings that you can't necessarily explain or hope for understanding. So singing a song automatically will draw somebody in, and it was a function, really, my voice and singing was a function of loneliness. And I noticed that when I would sing, grown-ups would smile and be entranced and be entertained. And I was like, oh, if I could just keep doing this, people will be happy to see me, and I will at least always have something to eat. And so it started out as trying to get attention and trying to assuage my loneliness. And then slowly I learned to express a lot of what had happened through metaphor and through sound and fury and nuance and all of that. I think art is also such a healing tool for people who are suffering. I really believe that if my mother had been born in, you know, maybe a circus family in France, she would be just this celebrated little contortionist or ballerina or something, instead of people seeing her as a burden, a problem, someone to be avoided, ignored, shunned. That's what killed her, I believe. That's what killed her, was the loneliness.
I'm so moved by, I've done so much research around what's working, and Dr. Bruce Perry at the Child Institute Trauma Center in Texas is doing work with somatosensory activities like yoga and mindfulness and art and music, and he's taking some of the most profoundly impacted children from trauma, kids who have seen wars, have seen their parents abducted or horrible things in their lives, and he's helping bring them back to recovery with a very light touch on pharmaceuticals. This is the kind of work that I think is incredibly groundbreaking, and I'm so moved by what Storm says, because my own experience in watching my daughter's grief after her dad died was that she wasn't ready to talk to a therapist. She refused to see a child psychologist, but she somehow found her way to her guitar and to her music. And she managed to claw her way out of her own grief with that. So it's a really important and effective tool. Chris, I want to talk about my experience in the mental health system was hard. I can't imagine how much harder it might be if you're Hispanic or you're Black or you're low income or you don't have a computer to be able to find out how to access care. Are people that are in these different cultural situations at a disadvantage?
Yes, they are. There's like lots of numbers to show that. One of the things that we know is that African Americans and Latinos receive treatment for mental illness at a half the rate that whites receive, and Asians at 1/3 of the rate that whites receive. There are so many reasons for that. There are reasons that come from the very culture. A difficulty to go out and seek help, but there's also very difficult access to culturally competent treatment. One of the things that we're actually working with the Alliance for the culturally specific programs in Portland to have navigators at Unity Center for Behavioral Health. So as people that belong to different cultures, different languages, et cetera, are discharging, they will have a navigator, a peer navigator that will come to help them navigate what's the next place to go, and with the knowledge of the variety of culturally specific programs that we have in our city that not everybody knows. So it will be a very cool aspect of what we're doing is this transitions of care, very thoughtful for cultural minorities.
My experience of having had my husband go home from the hospital after having just experienced this very serious suicide attempt and be sent home with a bunch of bags of prescriptions and no follow-up care, no second step for where he was to go next or who it was that was going to help him transition back into a pretty stressful life. I felt like that lack of a safety net doomed him. Yeah. How will that change with Unity?
You probably have heard of the movement of peer support specialists. An entire movement, yay!
There they are, back there.
There you go. We're working with them because it's so, for those of you who don't know, peer support specialist is a person with the lived experience of perhaps a mental illness or an addictions, but somebody that has a message of recovery because they're actually, they have gone through their journey, they are active in their journey every day, so their message is a message of hope. Because they, instead of being, what's wrong with you, is, look at me, it works. I'm doing pretty okay here, and I've been there, and I understand. So it also connects that individual immediately. It's like immediate trust building, because you know what that person went through. And so we're gonna have some peer support specialists that will be part of our staff, that will work in the psychiatric emergency service. And we're hoping to also partner with other organizations that will be bringing to co-locate with us peer navigators that will help folks navigate the next step of their journey towards recovery.
So like a big brother, big sister situation. Yeah. How can we help to expand that? Because that seems absolutely life-changing for people who really need help and support. So how can you expand that further? How can we help do that?
Well, in my mind, I think expanding the peer support service movement in Oregon has to do with political will and has to do with funding. We already reimburse for those services. This is new. It wasn't reimbursed a few years ago. Now it's reimbursable, so it's paid for, it's recognized. But I think each of our counties have to pony up more money and more political will to actually really expand that network of services.
If you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Sheila Hamilton, author of All the Things We Never Knew, here with Storm Large and Dr. Chris Ferentinos, talking about the impacts of mental illness. Stigma is such a reality with mental health. I'm wondering if both of you could talk about a time in your life in which you really experienced the stigma of mental illness.
Oh, it's not pretty. My father shut out everybody. He couldn't deal with it anymore. My mother's illness had progressed and gotten so much worse. He didn't want to send her away because she would have nowhere to go but the hospital. But finally, her parents intervened and helped her get an assisted living facility apartment. So it was moving day for my mother, moving out of the home, moving away. And I came home expecting her to be packed up and gone. And my brothers and father were in the living room. They looked shell-shocked, and they just couldn't really look at me. And I said, where's Mom? They just pointed. And so I went upstairs. Excuse me. She was naked and sobbing, and pills were everywhere, in the sink and on the floor and in her mouth. And she was crying and heaving like a child. And I threw a blanket over her, and I rolled my eyes, and I said, "Get out. Just go. Just go. You're gonna be fine. Just go." Because I didn't want to see it anymore. So that was me who did that.
Very, very, very difficult to share those things. Yeah. Well, Chris, I guess my story is a little different insofar I'm still emotional. Yeah.
I could tell you a dirty story, but I get away.
That's okay. I guess it's the healer in me. I mean, that's why I'm in the profession I am. It's because I really care. And anyway, but 1993, I met my husband in Rio de Janeiro, where I'm from, and fell in love, head over heels. I had a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old. And then, next thing I know, I'm entering the airplane with my 1-year-old, my 5-year-old, 6 bags, and leaving behind to come marry Bob, leaving behind what at the time I didn't know, because I wasn't thinking, leaving behind my profession, my status, my penthouse with a pool, my friends, my family, everything I knew, and my identity and a piece of my soul. So I moved to Portland, from Rio to Portland in '94. Whoa. That was a shock. And there was one side of me that was always very excited and happy because I was with the love of my life. We still are madly in love with each other. I have a wonderful relationship. And there was a dark cloud on the other side that started descending upon me. A grief, a depression, a sadness that was unbelievable, because home is that place where you learn to recognize before you even understand what things are. So palm trees and banana trees and coconut and beach and sunshine, you know, they are just running in my blood, and I'm just completely displaced at that point. I did not want to tell anybody. And I didn't fit in anywhere because I was living in Lake Oswego, and I tried to fit in with the mothers of the children there, and it just didn't fit in too well, and then, shocking. And then, no, I have nothing against mothers in Lake Oswego. Nothing. It's just that I didn't fit in that well, and then I started working for a Latino program. I was supervising a Latino program. But I was Brazilian, I wasn't Mexican, so I wasn't accepted as a Hispanic. So I wasn't Hispanic enough, so I couldn't fit anywhere. It was very dark and difficult. I mean, once again, the stigma part of it is, it took me a long time to actually admit to myself that I needed help, and to actually seek therapy and start reading about Buddhism and mindfulness. And to be very honest, that has been the most healing thing for me.
I also just want to share that in the aftermath of my husband's death by suicide, I found very much to have gone through the uncastral experience, which means that if you have somebody who's suffering from a mental illness or who has died by suicide, you don't get casseroles at your house, because people are extremely frightened about what they can do. They don't know how to reach out. They don't know how to show their humanness to you because they're so uncomfortable with the topic of mental illness. And in the week after my husband died, I was very much just in my own episodic depression, and a friend called and said, "You must come to this party. It's just a bunch of close friends. We really want to see you, get you out of the house." And I walked into the party, and there was a woman there that I didn't know very well, and she said to me, "Don't you feel so guilty about your husband's death?" And I said, "I'm sorry." And she said, "Well, he died by suicide. You should have been able to prevent it." I think that people have the opinion about suicide that it's not the end game of a mental illness that's been battled and lost. And we really need to change that. I would have loved to have been able to reach my husband. I would have loved to be able to force him into care. He was completely unwilling, he was stubborn, he was very difficult around the issue of accessing care. And I feel like in my own way of attempting to really save my own life and my daughter, that I did as much as I could for him. And if you could do one thing for me, when you're dealing with families that are in crisis, be the same kind of neighbor to them that they are if they were dealing with cancer, or if they had heart disease, or if there was some part of their existence that you know was challenging and you just wanted to be there as a friend. It really is so important that we begin to normalize the experience of mental illness, because as we saw by the hands in the room, we all have it. So.
And also, an important step in that is when someone dies tragically. Pink Martini just lost a member last year to suicide. Derek Reith was bipolar, and because of my experience with mental illness, I was sort of his person on tour, and I would try to wrangle him and make sure he was on his meds. But as Sheila said, if he lost a night's sleep, which everyone loses many nights' sleep on tour, he went into a deep episode, and it ended with him committing suicide last year. And no one knows what to say to a family member who's experienced that level of tragedy, except that woman who knew what to say, but she was an ass. She thought she knew what to say. But the family knows. We know you don't know what to say. There's nothing to say to make the person come back, to make the person better, to change the circumstances. But say anything, something, reach out, because it is the isolation and it is the loneliness that kills the spirit of the family member trying to support the person with mental illness. It's what keeps the person with mental illness from seeking help. So you don't have to know what to say, but do say something.
Sheila, I know that you did a lot of research to write your book, and you looked at some of the hopeful, promising practices that are out there. Is that something that, can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, and I am so happy to say that so many of the faces and the brilliant people that are leading this kind of hopefulness are right here in this room. Oregon really is going to lead the nation in the discussion around integrated care, in a push toward more holistic care, and the idea that mental illness is really trauma-based and that we can do more by recognizing that trauma is at the root of most of these illnesses. And it's so interesting to me to do a national sweep of what's working and then be able to find that it's right here at home. So if I could, please, just for 1 minute, recognize some of the incredible people in the room that are doing the best work in mental health. OHSU, of course, with its research and its science base, the Brain Institute has some of the best neuroscientists in the world attempting to try to find cures for some of these illnesses. Cascadia Behavioral Health, you know, the kind of work that they're doing just on addiction treatment and a center for wellness in our community with the building of the Garlington Center. It's what we need to do to normalize mental health. Trillium Family has, I think, shattered the stereotype and stigma of mental illness with a public campaign that really takes pop culture and music and the joy that we can feel in our everyday life and make people realize we all have mental health, we all have a stake in making sure it's well. And of course, Unity that Chris has been talking about. I really believe that Unity Behavioral Health is going to be a model for the nation in how we treat patients with dignity and respect, and we follow them through. And then, of course, the Tri-County area in terms of its response to mental health crises every single day, Washington County, Clackamas County, Multnomah County, these people, I just want to say, I wish we could pay you what a basketball player gets paid. I feel like the thought that every day you are out there saving people's lives and you're getting a salary that is nowhere near what you should be paid. I wish we could change that, but thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, because I have seen the work you do and it's tremendous. And if you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Sheila Hamilton, author of All the Things We Never Knew, here with Storm Large and Dr. Chris Ferrantinos, talking about the impact of mental health. And just a shout out to my station, Kink FM, for doing so much in furthering this conversation on the air, in the public. It's a huge, huge step for our company as well. Storm, I'm thinking about the genetic predisposition to illness and how terrified I am that my daughter might one day begin to show signs of bipolar disorder. And I'm wondering how you've coped with the knowledge that you have half of your mom's genes.
Well, when I was younger, I still do, but not as voraciously as I used to. I would read a lot of anecdotal psychology, not real psychological tomes of medical information that would just go right over my head, but anecdotal psychology of psychologists who wrote about interesting things. And anything, like I'd read psychiatric health and these brain science magazines and dorky things, looking for symptoms. I feel this way. Oh my God, I felt that way. Am I gonna wake up and be speaking gibberish? But as I learned more about trauma, as you say, my mother's illness was trauma-based. She was horribly, horribly abused for the first 4 years of her life, and then suffered more trauma throughout her young adulthood. And so she was diagnosed multiple times with whatever the doctor's expertise was, that's what she had. Whatever pad of paper from whatever pharmaceutical company sat on his desk. That was the drug that she got. And she was just, I don't know. I am afraid sometimes that I'm gonna lose my mind, but then sometimes I do lose my mind, and it's on stage, and it's awesome.
So that's one thing we really haven't talked about, are these brilliant gifts that are also a component of a mind that is prone to mental illness. I think that it might be something, Chris, you probably come across all the time, that I tend to see this, and I know that there's a lot of data that contradicts it, but my poet friends, my author friends, my performer friends, my musician friends, all of them seem to have a little bit of mental illness.
Well, my opinion is that if you look closely to all of us, I think you'll find that little bit in everybody.
In my experience, it's the normal ones. It's the normal ones you gotta look out for. The people who really, no, I'm so normal. It's like they have a box of human ears in their closet.
Right.
Probably one of the most profound things in all the research that I did on mental health was to realize that every one of us have the capability of being very ill. And that with enough nights of missed sleep and with the death of a loved one and with witnessing trauma or a move or a job loss, that any one of us could be pushed over into anxiety and depression, and especially if you have a genetic predisposition. So I want to talk to you, both of you, because you're in demanding jobs, about how you stay well. What's your thing on the road, Storm?
Honestly, it is one of the most difficult things is to maintain decent health on the road. It is, I tell young musicians who, I just want to be on tour and I just want to leave home and be on tour. And I'm just like, oh God, it is the most bone-crushingly exhausting thing. And that's really how prisoners of war are tortured, by sleep deprivation and loud noises to be kept awake. And so sometimes, trying to sleep on a lurching bus while driving all night through Romania, that's kind of like being tortured. But the best thing that I do is really, it's sleep. Lots of water, sleep. I would love to say that I get to go and party with strippers and get drunk and do that rock and roll thing all the time. No, I only do that when I come home to Portland.
I can't wait for tonight.
Because you have to sleep. You have to sleep, and you have to eat and stay hydrated and wash your hands like crazy when you're on an airplane.
Chris, any other tips?
Well, I think to me it's actually exercise. It's movement. It's dance. It's getting out of my brain and into my body. And I so many times I hear myself saying that to my husband on my way home. I'm going to have to stop at the gym. I got to get out of my brain. I got to get inside my body. And I basically, my boss is sitting here, he knows, I work out every morning, even though it makes me wake up like at ungodly hour of 5:30 in the morning. But it makes me sane. And mindfulness. All the studies I've done about practicing mindfulness have been perhaps the most transformative strategies that I have had in my life to be able to cope with the crazy pace of life and being in this automatic in front of a screen all the time, which can drive us away from ourselves.
I also just want to say, as a closing thought, that if you don't have that person in your life that you can call when you are feeling anxiety-ridden or you're having a bad day, find that person, because every bit of evidence I've ever come across suggests that one person in your life who listens openly, who doesn't judge, who can be there for you as a sounding board can save your life. And thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I have loved being here today. Storm Large and Dr. Chris Ferrantinos. So we have about 15 minutes. If you have a question, we would love to take any questions from the audience. There's a microphone set up over there if you'd like to just head on over.
I'm a City Club member. My name is Ray Amsinger, and there was a reference earlier to need for more funding, and my question would be, for any of you, what levels of government control mental health funding?
So you're asking, is this working? I'm sorry. What levels of government controls funding? You have several levels. You have state funding, you have county funding. The counties in Oregon are the local mental health authorities, so they have the responsibility for the mental health of our communities, and especially of the most vulnerable part of our community. And also the Medicaid, public funding through Medicaid and Medicare and federal. I mean, there's all levels, really. But in my experience, the local levels are the ones that can really do much more for our community.
Here's another question. Are laws like the one in California, which allow for the confiscation of guns from those accused of being mentally ill, a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Accused of
Yeah.
mental illness.
Yeah.
So, I don't even think I followed it.
Yeah, does it violate someone's right if they have a mental illness to have their gun taken away, is the way that I'm reading this.
Well, it's interesting. Just recently, and I'm not an expert in that subject, so pardon me, but just recently I know through our hospital security that a law was done here in Oregon that if a person shows up at our hospital that has had a brush with a violent suicide or whatnot, and they had a gun, that we actually can call the police to remove the gun from that person. It makes sense. I mean, it does make sense. But here's a myth for you, okay? Here's a myth. The myth is that people with mental illness are violent, and that they are the people that do the most violence out there. That's the opposite. People with a mental illness are 10 times more prone to receive violence, to be the recipient, the victims of violence. And only about 2% of the people with a mental illness will actually act violently. So that's a big myth about, whenever this conversation about guns and mental illness comes up, I think it's a cop-out, so we don't talk about gun control.
I have come to believe that perhaps we should say, yes, it is a mental health crisis. Yes, it is because of that, and give us the funding so we can do something about it.
Exactly.
If you're getting blamed for it anyway, perhaps there's a strategy we could use to get some of the funding back. It's a first step. Let's make care available for those who seek it, but how to deal with those too unwell to seek care for themselves. How to help people get care for their loved ones. Oregon in particular has laws making this difficult. I think they're talking about whether or not you have to force someone into care.
Yeah, and that's another big area of discussion. One of the things that parents come to me all the time, disheartened, because once their kid hits 18, they lose so much of the control and they cannot be involved in the care. There are some efforts in the legislature that actually passed to expand some HIPAA and some laws to allow providers to talk to parents. But, it's a conundrum. It's the conundrum of navigating between civil rights and getting people into care. And there's a lot of advocacy into civil rights. So it's a conundrum. I don't think there is a perfect solution.
We'd like to take some from the microphone, some questions.
Thank you. My name's Harriet Cook. I'm a member of City Club. I'm also a physician with a small practice in holistic mental health. And I'm also a member of a grassroots organization called Rethinking Psychiatry that was formed in support of Robert Whitaker's book, Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic. And I first want to thank you for bringing up the reality of recovery and the over-medicalization and the trauma issues. And I wanted to ask a question and bring up the other piece, which is the larger social, environmental setting that mental health problems come in. And there's a wonderful book by Wilkinson and Pickinson called The Spirit Level, which is, I also have a master's in public health, which talks about how the wider the income disparities, the greater the health issues, mental health, physical health, environmental health issues. And we live in a time when the income disparities are enormous, and finding housing and finding occupations, work. And so could you speak just a little bit about that larger bed in which mental health and trauma emerges? Thank you.
I just want to say, I think that's such an excellent question, because if you put a person who called themselves mentally well out on the street, and you force them to try to find a way to keep well during the rainy season in Oregon, and then you took away their car and they couldn't make it to a job interview the next day, and then the payments that were going to whatever to be able to sustain their food stamps got screwed up, let me tell you, you'd be mentally unwell. And so when we try to dissect mental illness, taking out the cultural components and the components of our economic wellness just seems to be a no-starter to me. It's so endemic. There's so much to developing a mental illness. And I feel like when we make a solution, it has to be community-wide, it has to be neighborhood-wide, it has to be statewide, and it has to be federal-wide. And that's why the topic of mental illness is so difficult. Chris, do you see it any differently?
No, I think she said it all. I mean, the context, the social determinants of health are now known to be incredibly important, and I think she said it all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, next question.
Dale Johnson, City Club member. This is really related a little bit to the last question. In listening, it occurs to me that, Dr. Fiorentino talked about how important it was for a patient to take ownership of their care, to help the doctors from getting lazy. And at the same time, Sheila Hamilton talked about, or suggested, that her husband resisted care. It's been my experience that many of the victims of mental health issues, whether it be low-grade autistic spectrum issues or depression or others, because of the shame and the blame and the issues that our culture thrusts upon them, very much resist the diagnosis or even the process of diagnoses. That brought to mind that much of this is cultural, that our culture as a whole is keeping the mentally ill from being able to seek help. So my question, and I'd like to address this to Dr. Fiorentino first, is if we could change our society to ideally address these issues so that people would be in a situation where they could find the care they need, what would that society look like? And maybe from there, how we could form it. Thank you.
Excellent point. I think that 30 years ago, people would not reveal to each other that they had cancer because it was a bad thing. It was a death sentence, and it was you were just maybe less or not so good. And the fact that we talk about cancer the way we talk today has increased screening, early screening, early detection, and treatment. And that is my hope for mental illness and addiction, is that we can talk freely about it as those are brain diseases, brain disorders. And another myth is that there's no cure, there's no, and I don't even want to say cure, but there's no treatment. That's not true. There are treatments that are very effective for all kinds of mental disorders and addictions as well. So that's the society I want to be a member of, and I want to contribute to get there. I think Unity Center for Behavioral Health, one of the things I'm advocating for is that we get some funding to do more PR about the success of treatment, the positive stories, the good stories that we can tell about recovery, about individuals in our society that are doing well, that come to Unity and can come out and tell good stories. Because we're gonna all hear the bad stories too, but it's the good stories, is the positive, is the message of hope that is gonna carry us through to that utopic society where mental illness will be just another disease that we all can talk about.
I just also would like to add, if I could wave a magic wand, I would like to see emotional literacy and mental health first aid taught from the time our kids are toddlers. Yeah, I don't know why there is a separation between how we teach kids to take care of themselves, to exercise what they do. If they actually get a wound on their leg, they know how to take care of it and put on a Band-Aid. But yet you might start having thoughts and behaviors happen in your life and you have no idea who to turn to or who to talk to about it. And then by the time you reach middle school, the cultural and social factors are so overwhelming that people do not know how to ask for help. We need to start at the very base level with our kids to teach them how to be whole citizens.
And also, I think what we're saying is compassion. A dream society would be a compassionate society, understanding that your situation is different from someone else's, and that's all right. Our differences are our strengths in many ways. But if we have compassion for one another, instead of looking for power over one another, we see little kids alienating the different kid, and that's so common. But we need to teach, as Sheila said, from a very early age about how to take care of ourselves, but also take care of each other, of our ill and of our weaker and of our different and of our same. We have to be compassionate.
Yeah. All right. Another question back there?
Thanks. Jeff McCarthy, City Club member. I'm a physician and a former hospital CEO. When I was in the VA, I could call up hundreds of thousands of medical records on my home computer. The only part I couldn't access was the mental health record. So my question is very direct for the three of you, and the audience may want to reflect on their own views. Should or should not the mental health treatment records be an integrated and open part of the general medical record?
Wow.
That's a big one.
Wow.
And I'm just going to say that we are actually struggling with that very question as we build our network of Unity Center with our partner hospitals, but also with other organizations. We are struggling with that very question. How much information exchange can save lives? And how important it is that people don't feel their rights violated and that they feel that they are respected. So it's that balancing act. So I don't have an answer. We're struggling with that very question. Of course, there is the law, the federal law. We have to follow the law always. But there are certain gray areas that pose a big question. I'll tell you what, I'm in favor of more openness because I think that will create more coordination of care and health.
I just want to end that last thought. I had a great conversation with Dave Sanders, who was the CEO of Zoom Care, and he told me that as many as half of the people who come to Zoom Care thinking they're sick are actually suffering from a mental health disorder. Think about that, how much we could save if we were actually diagnosing, treating, actually responding to these people in a way that didn't get them in the labyrinths of hospital care, but actually got them into a mental health treatment, which is a lot less expensive. So thank you again for a wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed being here today.
We're out of broadcast time for further questions. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. In addition to the great thanks for our guests, please thank Bobby Regan of the Friday Forum Committee who produced today's program. We are adjourned.